Imagine a world where the king once beloved now staggers through candlelit corridors haunted by visions and driven by fear. His court is paralyzed not by enemies at the gates, but by the unpredictable madness within their own palace. Welcome to France in the early 1400s, where power is not just fragile, it's fractured. King Charles VI's mind is slipping. One day he believes he is made of glass, terrified he'll shatter if touched. The next he swings a sword at his own men, mistaking friends for traitors. Sometimes he doesn't even know he's king. The fate of a nation now hangs on the whims of a mind unraveling. When a monarch loses his grasp, who truly rules in France? It's the Council of Regents. But in reality, the court is a battleground for two great houses, each more obsessed with power than with peace. On one side, the Armagnacs, led by Louis, Duke of Orleans, brother to the king. He's bold, rich, charismatic, and according to rumor, perhaps too close to the queen for comfort. His followers champion tradition, the farms, the fields, the old order. Facing them, the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. They control the northeast, the beating heart of French commerce, and their coffers overflow thanks to English trade. They dream of a modern France filled with thriving cities and industry. But this isn't just politics, it's deeply personal. Old grudges fester into new betrayals. There are whispers that Louis tried to seduce John's wife. Assassins stalk the night. The power struggle becomes a civil war. Cousins turn on cousins, brothers on brothers. Paris changes hands more than once. The banners over the city swap from gold and blue to black and yellow. Every town, every family, every peasant is forced to pick a side or risk losing everything. At times, the violence is so senseless, so intimate, it feels more like a family feud than a war for a kingdom. The 100 Years' War rages on, but the English see their chance, as French lords spill each other's blood. Henry V marches his armies through the chaos, claiming land and glory. Once mighty France is split into pieces. Royalists, rebels, invaders, peasants suffer the most. Their villages burn, fields are left to rot, famine stalks the land. Even the church offers no comfort. Europe is torn by the Western Schism. At one point, 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the true voice of God. Each French faction chooses a pope to suit its cause. In this swirl of violence and confusion, faith becomes a weapon, another way to divide the people. Imagine the terror of the ordinary villager. One morning, soldiers thunder in demanding oaths of loyalty and taxes. The next day, men in different colors arrive with different threats and promises. There is no safe choice, no true refuge. For many, it seems the kingdom is cursed, abandoned by both reason and by God. The nobility fight for titles and revenge. The common people fight to survive. And through it all, the king sits, sometimes lucid, often lost, while his country tears itself apart. But in the darkest hours, history tells us hope can come from the most unexpected places. In a quiet village far from the chaos, a young girl begins to hear a voice, one that will change the fate of France forever. In the far northeast of France, far from the towers of Paris and the intrigue of royal courts, lies the small farming village of Domremy. For centuries, life here changed little. People worked the fields, herded cattle, spun cloth, and clung to the rhythms of the church calendar. But it's here among muddy lanes and weathered cottages that history's course would soon shift forever. Joan was born into this world, just another daughter in a family of peasants. Her father was respected in the village. Her mother was known for her kindness. From a young age, Joan's life was filled with simple duties, tending animals, helping in the fields, learning prayers from her mother. By all accounts, she was devout, hardworking and serious beyond her years. But in a France torn by war and doubt, even the smallest life could not remain untouched. News of burned towns, armies on the march, and shifting allegiances would sometimes reach Domremy, carried by passing soldiers or traders. Joan and her neighbors lived with a quiet fear, the sense that the world beyond their fields was spiraling out of control. And then when Joan was about 13, something extraordinary happened. She began to hear voices, clear and insistent. At first, she tried to ignore them, but the voices persisted, returning again and again. They spoke of God's will. They called her Joan the Maid and told her she was chosen for a task no one else could accomplish to save France. At first, Joan kept these visions secret, confiding only in her family, but the voices grew louder, more urgent. She saw radiant figures whom she later identified as St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. They instructed her not just to pray, but to act. God, they said, had a mission for her: drive out the English, restore the rightful king, and deliver France from its agony. Think for a moment what that would mean. A teenage girl in a world where women's voices rarely counted, being told by heavenly messengers to lead armies and counsel kings. Joan hesitated, doubted and prayed for guidance, but the voices gave her no rest. Eventually, she could not ignore the call. Joan set out for the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, asking the local commander for an escort to the royal court. Imagine his shock, a peasant girl dusty from the road declaring she carried a message from God. For the King of France, she was laughed at, sent away, even accused of madness or heresy. But Joan would not give up. Each time she was turned away, she returned. More determined news of the strange girl began to spread. Some called her a fool. Others wondered, could she be a sign from God, an answer to their desperate prayers? It's easy for us centuries later to doubt the miraculous, to see visions as dreams or symptoms of stress. But in Joan's time, faith shaped every corner of life. The line between heaven and earth seemed thin and divine. Intervention was not only possible, it was expected in times of crisis. And Joan, by the force of her conviction, began to persuade others. After persistent appeals, the local commander agreed to send her to the royal court at Chinon. Joan disguised herself in men's clothes for safety on the dangerous journey, a scandalous choice in that era, but one that showed her determination and sense of purpose. She rode for days through war-ravaged countryside, narrowly avoiding bandits and enemy patrols. When she finally arrived at Chinon, she faced a skeptical, nearly broken court. Charles VII, the Dauphin, the would-be king, was surrounded by doubters and schemers. Rumors questioned his legitimacy. His resources were dwindling. Hope was nearly gone. But Joan's confidence was magnetic. She asked for a private audience, and legend says she picked out Charles from a crowd of courtiers, having never met him before. She spoke simply but powerfully, assuring him that God had sent her to see him crowned at Reims, the ancient coronation site of French kings. The royal advisors hesitated. Was she a prophet, a fraud, or a pawn of rival factions? To be certain, they summoned theologians to question Joan, probing her beliefs, her visions, her motives. She faced them with humility and unwavering faith. Their conclusion: she was pious, honest, and sincere. There was no evidence of heresy. At last, Charles decided to take a chance. What did he have to lose? Joan was entrusted with a suit of armor, a horse, and a small escort. She was no longer simply Joan from Domremy. She was now Joan the Maid, carrying the hopes of a broken nation on her shoulders. The road from Chinon to Orléans was more than just a journey. It was a test of faith, not only for Joan, but for all of France. By the time Joan arrived at the gates of Orléans in 1429, the city was suffocating. Surrounded by English forces, its people were battered, hungry, and losing hope. The river that should have brought life now marked the line between survival and surrender. But as Joan rode in wearing her shining armor and carrying her banner of Jesus and Mary, something changed in the air. Soldiers who had grown weary of defeat straightened their backs. The citizens whispered, was this girl really sent by God? Was she the miracle they had begged for in their darkest prayers? It wasn't just the English who doubted her. Many of the French commanders looked at Joan and saw only a naive peasant unschooled in the brutal art of war. She was questioned, even mocked, but Joan refused to back down. Her confidence was not arrogance, it was certainty, the kind that rattles skeptics and inspires the desperate. Joan listened, learned, and then acted. Where others hesitated, she pressed forward. She visited the sick and wounded, gave comfort to the terrified, and rallied the soldiers. But she also insisted on discipline: no looting, no drunkenness, no cruelty to the innocent. For Joan, this war was not just about reclaiming territory. It was a holy mission, a fight for the soul of France. The siege was a deadly stalemate. The English had built a ring of forts, earthworks bristling with archers and cannon cutting the city off from the outside world. Traditional tactics had failed, and the commanders expected to outlast their enemy through patience. But Joan was different. She didn't believe in waiting for slow starvation to decide the city's fate. Her faith demanded action. Joan called for an attack direct, bold, seemingly reckless. Many officers refused, fearful of disaster. Yet step by step, Joan's resolve pulled the army with her. She led from the front, riding into battle with her standard high as arrows and stones rained down. Her presence was electric. Even seasoned fighters found new courage at her side. It wasn't just strategy that turned the tide, it was spirit. On May 7, 1429, as the French stormed the final English bastion, Joan was struck by an arrow driven through her shoulder. She fell, but refused to leave the field. When others faltered, she rose, rallied the troops, and pressed the assault. By nightfall, the English stronghold had fallen. Orléans was free. For the first time in years, France tasted victory. Joan had delivered not just a city, but a message the impossible could be done. The enemy was not invincible. More than any sword or banner, it was hope renewed, burning and unstoppable that Joan brought to Orléans. And as word spread of her triumph, people across France, peasants and nobles alike, began to believe that God had not abandoned them after all. Victory at Orléans sent a shockwave through France. For the first time in decades, there was not just hope, but momentum. Joan's success transformed her from a curiosity into a legend, her name spreading from battlefield to peasant cottage, whispered with awe and gratitude, but her mission was far from over. From the beginning, Joan's vision had been clear: to see Charles the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king at Reims, the sacred site where French monarchs had received their authority for centuries. To most, this dream seemed impossible. Reims lay deep within enemy territory, and the road was dotted with English garrisons and hostile towns. But Joan was undeterred. She urged Charles to act. Her energy was infectious, her faith unwavering. She promised not just victory, but destiny fulfilled. The French court, once crippled by doubt, now found itself swept along by the urgency of her conviction. For the first time, Charles gathered his courage, and the army marched north. It was not a campaign of easy triumphs. Castles and bridges had to be taken one by one each, a dangerous gamble. Joan led from the front as always. Her presence emboldened troops and terrified the enemy. When ambushes threatened, she seemed to sense them before they struck. Towns that had long wavered between English and French allegiances opened their gates, inspired by her reputation. Along the way, Joan's legend only grew. Soldiers swore she could foresee danger. Priests called her the new Deborah or Judith. Even skeptics in the royal camp began to wonder if they were witnessing something truly divine. Finally, after a grueling march, Charles and his entourage approached Reims. The city, recognizing a moment in history, surrendered without a fight. On July 17, 1429, in the soaring cathedral, Charles was crowned King Charles VII. Joan stood beside him, banner in hand, tears on her cheeks. The impossible had become reality. It should have been a storybook ending, a perfect victory, but history rarely works that way. For Joan, the coronation was not a finish line, but a beginning. Her mission, as she understood it, was to see France free, not just crowned, but united. But at court, politics reared its head once more. The same doubts and rivalries that had torn France apart began to resurface. Many of Charles's advisors, ever cautious, wanted to negotiate with powerful enemies like the Duke of Burgundy, rather than press on to drive the English from all French soil. Joan found herself sidelined, her advice ignored. She had delivered a miracle, but now the old patterns reasserted themselves: hesitation, compromise, intrigue. The fire that had driven the campaign to Reims was being smothered by fear and calculation. It's a pattern as old as leadership itself. The visionary inspires, the cautious consolidate. Joan was a woman of action, of faith. The court was a world of diplomacy, of delay. The two could not easily coexist. For the first time, Joan tasted frustration. The king she had crowned seemed unwilling to seize the moment. The dream of a liberated France so close was slipping through her fingers. Yet Joan would not give up. Her story was far from over. Joan's triumph at Reims should have marked the dawn of a new era for France. But history is rarely merciful to its heroes. Instead of pushing forward with unstoppable momentum, the French court slid back into old habits: politics, hesitation, and compromise. Joan, ever restless, urged Charles and his advisors to march on Paris and strike, while hope still burned bright. But her voice grew fainter among the calculating whispers of courtiers and noblemen, many of whom had never truly believed in her miracles. Instead of seizing the moment, the royal court negotiated a fragile truce with their rivals, the powerful Burgundians, while the English still held key strongholds. But peace bought through half measures rarely lasts. The truce soon frayed. When hostilities resumed, Joan returned to the front lines, her sense of urgency undiminished. Paris, the glittering prize, still stood unconquered. Joan threw herself into the assault, but the city was better defended than any she'd faced before. Walls bristling with archers and crossbow bolts, a population loyal to the Burgundians and commanders reluctant to risk everything on a single attack. During the assault, Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt piercing her thigh. Even wounded, she tried to rally her troops, refusing to give in to pain or defeat. But the attack faltered, and Paris remained in enemy hands. For the first time since Orléans, Joan tasted bitter failure. The months that followed were a blur of skirmishes, minor victories, and growing isolation. At court, her influence waned. The same advisors who had once marveled at her boldness now viewed her as a liability, a reminder of a risk they no longer wished to take. Letters she wrote to the king went unanswered. She was kept at a distance, her counsel politely ignored. But Joan's sense of mission never faded. She continued to fight, to lead, to inspire, until the day fate finally turned against her. In May 1430, during a campaign to defend the besieged town of Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces. She was pulled from her horse and surrounded, betrayed not just by enemies, but by the shifting allegiances of war. Her captors knew the value of their prize. Joan was sold to the English, who saw her as more than an enemy commander. To them, she was a symbol, a figure whose very existence undermined their claims to France. If they could break Joan, they could break the hope she inspired. She was taken to Rouen, imprisoned in a cold stone cell. No armor, no banner, no army. Just a teenage girl now facing the full weight of her enemy's wrath. The English and their church allies prepared a show trial designed not for justice, but for humiliation. They accused her of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, twisting every detail of her story to suit their needs. Yet even in captivity, Joan did not yield. Questioned by theologians and lawyers, she spoke with the same clarity and courage she had shown on the battlefield. She refused to betray her visions or her faith, even when threatened with torture. Her answers, often simple and direct, left her accusers flustered and frustrated. But the trial was never about truth. It was about destroying a symbol. Joan was condemned as a heretic and sentenced to die. On the morning of her execution, as the flames were lit in the market square of Rouen, a single English soldier held a crucifix high so she could see it through the smoke. Joan called out to Jesus. As the fire consumed her, her courage unbroken to the end. In that moment, her enemies believed they had silenced her forever, but history had other plans. The trial of Joan of Arc in Rouen was as much theatre as it was judgment, a calculated effort to erase both the girl and her legend. The English and their church allies needed more than a battlefield victory. They needed to break the myth that had inspired an entire nation. But how do you extinguish a miracle? Joan faced her interrogators not in secret, but in the cold light of day, surrounded by dozens of churchmen and scholars. They bombarded her with questions meant to trap or confuse. How could a peasant girl claim to speak with saints? Why had she dared to wear men's clothing? Was her faith truly orthodox or the work of evil spirits? Yet Joan, barely 19, held her ground with a clarity and honesty that stunned even her accusers. When asked if she was in God's grace, she replied simply, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." It was an answer that revealed both humility and unshakable conviction, a response that still echoes through the centuries. Day after day, her examiners pressed her, hoping to catch a slip, a contradiction, a sign of heresy. Joan answered plainly when she could, dodged when she must, but never betrayed her visions, her king, or her mission. When they threatened her with torture, she showed fear, but not surrender. Even stripped of power, she refused to give them the confession they wanted. The verdict was never in doubt. Joan was declared a relapsed heretic, an enemy not just to England, but to the church itself. On May 30th, 1431, she was led to the marketplace of Rouen, bound to a wooden stake. The crowd was thick with soldiers, townsfolk, and priests. Some jeered, some wept. One English soldier, moved by her faith, held up a crucifix for her to see. As the flames rose, Joan called out to Jesus, her voice clear even through the smoke. She asked for forgiveness, even for her executioners. When the fire finally consumed her, the executioner himself was said to have wept, fearing he had damned his soul. But Joan's death was not the end. The English burned her body twice, over scattering the ashes in the river, determined that no relics, no memories, no hope would remain. They spread word of their justice across Europe, confident that the legend of the maid would die with her. Yet almost immediately her story began to grow. The trial was denounced as a sham, a political tool, a miscarriage of justice. Joan, once a divisive figure, became a symbol not just of the Armagnac cause, but of France itself. Her courage in the face of betrayal and death inspired generations. Decades later, a new court would re-examine her case and clear her name. Centuries after her death, the same church that condemned her as a heretic declared her a saint. Joan of Arc, peasant girl, visionary warrior, became not just a hero, but a legend. Today, her story reminds us of the power of faith and conviction, of the danger of fear and small-mindedness, and of the way a single courageous voice can change the course of history. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc in Rouen could not destroy her story. Instead, her memory spread like wildfire, first in whispers among the oppressed, then in songs and legends, and finally in the halls of power and the heart of a nation. Joan's legacy was never simple. For decades, she was both a martyr and a cautionary tale invoked by rival factions in France as proof of their cause. But over time, her life came to represent something greater than politics or war. Joan became the symbol of faith against doubt, action against despair, courage against overwhelming odds. Her story was kept alive by those who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, women challenging the limits of their time, the poor demanding a voice, nations searching for hope in their darkest hours. French kings would eventually point to Joan as proof that their right to rule came from God's will, not merely royal blood. Soldiers saw her as the spirit of resistance. Ordinary people looked to her for comfort, that even in a world of powerful men, one humble soul could change history. It took nearly 500 years for the world to fully recognize her greatness. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc, officially declaring her a saint. The girl who had once been mocked as a madwoman and burned as a heretic was now venerated in churches across the world. Today, statues of Joan stand not just in France, but across continents, her armor shining, her banner lifted high, her eyes fixed on a vision that only she could see. Each year, her feast day is celebrated as a symbol of unity, courage, and faith. But perhaps Joan's greatest victory is not in any battlefield or court, but in the countless hearts she's inspired. Her story urges us to listen to our convictions, to fight for what's right, even when the world says it's impossible. She reminds us that true change often comes from the most unlikely places, from those who dare to believe when everyone else has given up. As the centuries pass, the world still returns to Joan of Arc, not just to marvel at her courage, but to find hope. In the face of fear and uncertainty, we remember the young woman who stood before kings and armies, guided not by power, but by the strength of her belief. That is Joan's real miracle, to show us that faith, courage, and conviction can outlast any fire, any injustice, any darkness. The story of the Maid of Orleans will never fade,